This podcast is sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Experience the difference an independent pharmacy can make for you and your loved ones. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy offers personalized care, short wait time, very competitive pricing, easy transfer of your prescription, and much more. And by Molly Maid. During these times of COVID-19, it has never been more important to keep your family safe. With the Healthy Home Cleaning System, Molly Maid London is here to help. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Today, we are thrilled to chat with London's own AnnaLise Trudell. She is a gender equity consultant and the manager of education, training, and research at Anova, the Women's Shelter and Sexual Assault Centre in London, Ontario. She brings extensive analysis of the causes and impacts of gender-based violence and of prevention programming through her doctoral and postdoctoral research at Western University. As manager at Anova for over a decade, she has overseen the facilitation, curriculum development, and evaluation of youth anti-violence programming and professional trainings. She is a seasoned public educator and facilitator with over 500 lectures and presentations engaging youth, professionals, and post-secondary students through public education.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be. We welcome you to the Vickers Crossing podcast. The Vickers Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. And I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church in London.
Kevin George here from St. Aidan's Anglican Church, and I got a surprise for you today.
My name is Ian. I'm a singer-songwriter, producer, content creator, and I don't know if I should be terrified or very excited for the surprise, Kevin.
Can you explain to our listening audience what a content creator is?
I use it as a general term for someone who posts things on the internet. So like I stream on Twitch and make YouTube videos and make music, and it's all just content. So it's an umbrella term. You
have a Twitch?
Yeah.
I can get you a pill for that.
Is there something they can do to help with that?
It's a live streaming website. We can talk about this later.
Okay. All right. Okay.
This is their internet they've been talking about.
That's that web thing.
Yeah, I heard about that.
Yeah.
Today, guys, we've got a great guest, and so happy that she could join us today. Dr. AnnaLise Trudell will be here. AnnaLise is from Anova here in London. If you're listening from London, you certainly know the important work that they do. If you're outside of the London area, you will find out more about Anova and AnnaLise's work as the manager of education, training, and research at Anova. So happy that she could join us, which was really at the last minute. She was very generous to be able to jump in because originally we were supposed to have Nicole Lim on the podcast today, but Nicole could not join us. We've rescheduled that to November, so we'll look forward to welcoming her then. But AnnaLise is here and will be joining us in just a couple of minutes.
Awesome. In the meantime, we want to acknowledge here at Vickers Crossing that our podcast is recorded on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Pewak, and Attawandaron peoples, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties, and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, who we consider to be vital contributors to our society and to the culture around us. And we pray with them for reconciliation and opportunities to work together for a just society for all people.
Thank you. And thank you to our sponsors here at the Vickers Crossing. Again, we want to say hello to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. Our thanks to Dave Mullen for his support. And hello to everybody over at A. Miller George today.
Amen. And Dave, the Knights are taking in 5,400 people at a game, eh? So myself and Rob and Ian, we stand by on the ready. Okay, we're ready when you are. Okay, yeah, and getting on to to our friend Carol Basada, Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, and locally loved. Get all your pharmaceutical needs today. Go in, give her your prescription. She'll move it over from whatever place you're at, whatever big box place, and you can get the care that you deserve from a local pharmacist. And if you mention Revy Kevy, you'll get a 10% discount.
Last, ooh, yeah. And last but certainly not least, we want to say a huge thank you to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And Trisha Lister was a wonderful human being who hooked us up with that. Call them, get your house cleaned,
Yeah.
Everything.
Get everything.
They do it
Everything
all.
clean. Yeah. Clean it all.
They'll
All
clean
right.
everything.
Thanks to all our sponsors. Really appreciate your support here. Guys, it's time for a very popular segment now in the Vickers Crossing. And, my family is overwhelmed by the amount of mail I'm having them sift through every day. People writing to talk about how much they're enjoying this segment. So we won't make them wait any longer. Kevin, it's time for, hey, man, who in the world did you book this week?
Oh, am I ever glad you asked? Could I have a drum roll, please? That's enough. This week, we booked Brian Zond. And you'll remember Brian Zond is a returning guest to the podcast. We had Brian on a little over a year ago. And Brian has a new book out that is called When Everything's on Fire, which is usually what happens to me after having a good Mexican food. And so I don't think that's what the book is about, but we're gonna have Brian Zond on here to talk about When Everything is on Fire. And he's going to be joining us in December, right before Christmas. Hopefully we won't be talking about Christmas trees on fire and all that stuff, but we're going to be talking about When Everything's on Fire. Very excited to have Brian come on.
Good. Look forward to that. All right, guys. Happy to have AnnaLise Trudell from Anova joining us, and she is in our waiting room. So we're going to bring her in and start our conversation right now here on the Vickers Crossing.
Let's bring in Dr. Trudell.
And we are happy today to welcome into the Vickers Crossing Dr. AnnaLise Trudell, who is the Manager of Education, Training, and Research at Anova here in London. And AnnaLise, welcome to the Vickers Crossing. How are you today?
I'm really happy to be here. I'm curious to see where you folks bring us in conversation today.
Oh, okay. Good. Well, we will do our best, and we're happy to have you here. And we have lots to talk about today. So
we're pretty excited that you jumped in too, because today was to be Nicole Lim, who's going to join us now in November because of an emergency. She couldn't join us. And within a couple of hours notice, boom, AnnaLise said, yes, I can do this. So thank you for being that flexible.
Yes.
For sure. Happy to be here.
Okay. Well, look, just a little bit more about AnnaLise. As Rob had mentioned, she is the gender equity consultant and the manager of education, training, and research at Anova, the Women's Shelter and Sexual Assault Center here in London, Ontario. AnnaLise brings extensive analysis of the causes and impacts of gender-based violence and the prevention programming through her doctoral and postdoctoral research at Western University. As a manager at Anova for over a decade, she's overseen the facilitation, curriculum development, and evaluation of youth anti-violence programming and professional trainings. AnnaLise is a seasoned public educator and facilitator with over 500 lectures and presentations engaging youth professionals and post-secondary students through public education. She is somebody that we should all be proud of here in London, Ontario, and we've had plenty of reason to sadly, to have to tune into much of the work that you're doing in the past month or so here, and we'll get to some of that. But before we do, I wonder if you might share a little bit about with our listeners about Anova, about the work that it does. Anova is something which is important to us here on the podcast. We were a big part of that 55 Hours for Hope that we did here and raise money for the work that you folks are doing over there, the important work that you're doing. So a little bit about Anova. And the other thing that's not in that bio, which is really important for people to know, is AnnaLise also hosts a podcast, a really good podcast. So I'd like for you to tell people about the podcast. I was supposed to be on the podcast early on, and I was a very, very naughty boy in that I completely missed it. I had the date in wrong. And sadly, AnnaLise was phoning all over the place to try and track me down. And I've been on my knees asking repentance of the Lord ever since. So AnnaLise was very forgiving, far more forgiving of me than I was of myself. But nonetheless, I have listened to it and it's incredible. So could you please tell people about the work you're doing at Anova, what Anova is for our listeners worldwide who won't know what that is, and the work that you're doing on that podcast, because I think it's really a critical piece.
Well, you really don't need to beg for any more forgiveness, Kevin.
Okay.
But we will get you on that podcast at some point.
Thank you.
For sure.
Pray for me, also a sinner.
So yeah, Anova, I mean, in some ways we like to point to this as a point of pride and also not. We are the largest gender-based violence organization in the province. So we have multiple sites. We have 2 sites that are high security shelter for women and kiddos who are experiencing violence in the home. We have a transition apartment building. So that's sort of a longer term space, again, for women and kiddos that are fleeing violence in their home. We provide the sexual assault counseling services for the region. So those are sort of clinicians that do that work on an ongoing basis. We provide the 24/7 crisis and support line for the region. So anyone can call that, whether it's a survivor, someone trying to support someone else, a practitioner trying to figure out how to best support someone. And we provide public education and prevention work. So that involves both sort of engaging youth, but also professional trainings, things like disclosure trainings for folks who might get disclosures in their role, bystander trainings, whatever that might be. So yeah, both point of pride and sort of not that we are that in position of being the largest. Thank you for shamelessly plugging the podcast that we started about a year ago, Piece by Piece. So peace as in world peace, and the latter piece as in the pieces of a puzzle. So what are the different pieces of the puzzle that we need to create a world that's peaceful without violence? And so each episode engages something related to preventing violence in the full spectrum of what that might entail, and just sort of more conversational. Similar to this one, more conversational.
Right. Yeah. And wherever you get your podcast, folks, you will find it, and you won't be disappointed by listening to it. And it really is a way of raising the conversation, elevating the things that need to be elevated. And I can't say enough about the work you folks are doing at Anova. It's close to my heart. I try to do what I can. We do here on the podcast, and thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you for all your support over the years.
Thank you. AnnaLise, wanted to ask a little bit about a topic that's been here in London that people have been certainly tuned to over the last few weeks with what's been going on at University of Western Ontario. And for those in the London area, they obviously would know about this. Perhaps our listeners that are outside of the area, not much. So just as a bit of a background, last month, police made some arrests in separate incidents. 4 students reported being sexually assaulted at Western. The university and police are also investigating reports of sexual violence during orientation week that circulated on social media and mainly through the app TikTok. Indications were that there were up to 30 sexual assaults on one weekend. And after reaching out to more than 600 students, the London Police Service says it has been unable to substantiate any unconfirmed social media reports of drugging and sexual assaults at the Medway Sydenham Hall residence at Western. And rumors began circulating online after orientation week, claiming that up to 30 female students were allegedly drugged and sexually assaulted around mid-September. So the investigation remains open. I'm wondering, from where you sit and the work you do, are you surprised that there have been no confirmations of these alleged assaults so far?
I'm not. But I do want to take a moment and not sort of in an aggressive way at all, but talk about language use for a second. And this whole conversation has been important about language use. So in the media, and you're quoting it directly, sort of unsubstantiated or sort of confirmed. And the tricky part is we all want the data. So we're all looking for, where's the proof that there were these 30 women that were raped? And what does proof look like in this context? For so many of us, it would look like a formal police report, something that's grounded in what systems we know. But what we know for sexual assault is from Stats Canada, less than 5% of survivors actually go to the police. So if that's where you're looking for your sort of substantiated, confirmed, this did indeed happen data, it's never going to be representative.
Right.
And so what are other places that we can seek to know sort of whether this is true? Of course, folks posting about it is a truth because they have nothing to gain by that. That is sort of really them just trying to tell their truth. But there's other points. We've had an increase in calls on our crisis line and requests for service in our counseling program. So have other similar agencies locally. There have been definitely an increase in rape kits done at our local hospital related to this. And those numbers aren't published, but they're all sort of touched on moments to help us figure out what played out. But in the media and in the public conversation that played out over the last month locally, there's been a lot of focus on sort of survivors coming forward to the police, and the police, there's been nothing. And does this mean that this was all just this wackadoodle conversation that got blown up? And by no means were you intending that, Rob. But I think overall, how we talk about this is so important, because we know that most survivors will not go to the police. So that is not where we can look for the truth.
Okay.
Right. And I, you know, I'm going to jump in and seek forgiveness again, because I wrote the question, not Rob. AnnaLise, I'm going to
good ownership.
I don't want Rob getting beat up over this. So
when I wasn't beating him up, just to be clear.
No.
And so the thing is, actually, as I was quoting that stuff and putting it together, I felt unease or dis-ease with writing it, if you know what I mean. So I think that this is what makes this conversation so critically important, actually, is the language, right? So even as I'm putting this together in haste this afternoon, I'm like, you know, like I don't want the question to sound like a lack of belief, you know what I mean? And so I think that I really appreciate your answer to Rob, and that we shouldn't be surprised by this because of the fact that, you know, less than 5%, but also that we need to sort of really come to grips with the language and the markers that we use, right? So it's what are we using to validate someone's lived experience, and why do we need to validate it in the first place? Like, you know, someone's lived pain is what it is, and as you said, sharing that over TikTok or Facebook or wherever it is its own way of sharing, right? So I just think about dignity on a broader level, and you know, we talk about this in church circles when we talk about respecting the dignity of every human being in our baptismal covenant. And I wonder what it says about us when our language, as you've pointed out, sort of disbelieves or devalues somebody's lived experience from the get-go, when it's dignity that we ought to be concerned about.
Fair enough. And I think it does come from a place that isn't malicious.
No.
But it does come from a bias where we work within a system where we believe that, you know, there's only one truth, that we can't hold two truths, that we can't hold the notion that, you know, someone may have experienced something as a sexual assault and someone else may not have been intending to actually cause that degree of harm. And those can be two truths. Now, I'm not saying that's what played out in this instance, but the struggle of sort of holding two truths, the struggle of wanting proof, which is what our legal system requires of us for something to be held as a truth. But in the reality of our culture and society, that would never be the barometer that we use to sort of substantiate someone's truth. And I think there's a bias around sexual violence and sexual assault that's not at play in other ways. So, you know, even when folks posted to TikTok, I had reporters and others sort of being like, well, like, you know, maybe they're just sort of like creating a bit of drama or whatever other language
content, you know.
Yes. And as if there's something to gain, right? And I think there's a deep reflection that we need to do around what is there to be gained by posting about my trauma. And if it is attention at its very sort of quote unquote worst, if it is attention, does that just mean another way of saying like connection and healing? Like, does that person, are they just craving something that is actually not a bad thing, that is connection and healing? And they're seeking it in a particular way, but
amen.
I'm a student at Fanshawe, just as a little bit of a background. I'm not a huge party goer. I'm kind of a loner.
He lives in that room, AnnaLise. He never leaves.
Never leaves.
Oh no.
That's not entirely true. That's not entirely true. I say that.
The
joking.
great musician, actually. He does good work. So.
This isn't about me.
Okay, sorry.
I want to ask you about how alcohol and the party atmosphere sort of plays into and connects to the sexual assault cases, and maybe if you could touch upon how alcohol can change the culture around the sexual assault and these just terrible actions that people can follow through with.
Thanks for bringing that up, because that is an important part of this. And it's also another example of where how we talk about the issue often goes askew. So alcohol doesn't cause rape.
Not at all.
Right. And you didn't say that, but that's often where the implication goes, is
sure.
that sort of in drinking cultures, therefore we have sexual assault as though that's a causal link. It's a correlation. But anyways, here we are. So when we talk about sexual assault and alcohol, more than 50% of sexual assaults involve alcohol. So again, that's from Stats Canada data. And when we think about what that means the intentional use by somebody to get somebody else drunk, to create precarity, to create vulnerability. But it also means, and we know this from more and more emerging data, we have great data on survivors. We have less great data on perpetrators, and we need more of the latter to actually get at the issue. But we know from some emerging research that the perpetrator's use of alcohol affects their behavior. So not just men, but predominantly men, when they drink, they become aroused by deterrence, more aggressive in their pursuit, and they will push through sort of initial no's. So it affects their behavior in ways that it wouldn't otherwise. And I think this is important for us to call attention to, because we've done a lot of work around sort of women in the buddy system when we go out drinking and sort of in that culture. But what about men in the buddy system? If you notice that your dude is super getting drunk, maybe stop him from drinking more, because he's actually going to engage in behavior that's really problematic. And that's where we need to shift the conversation. Alcohol, again, never causes sexual assault. It affects behaviors, but the person's still responsible.
It's also we talk a lot about, sorry to jump in, but we talk a lot about how women can solve these issues or whatever, and we don't discuss how a lot of the problem areas lie with the men at these parties, and it's not the alcohol that's the reason that they do these things. It's the person within that do these things, and the alcohol is just a contributing factor to it. We don't target our boys to do the right thing, and we kind of let them. Boys will be boys is a terrible thing when it comes to these things, because it's just such a horrible statement of just being like, oh, it's just men being men, which is not the case, because they should be held accountable for their actions and not do these things in the first place. Anyway.
Amen to that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know what Ian is raising this. I as I was listening to you, Ian, I was thinking about that whole conversation that was very public back in 2016, I guess, when the previous president of the United States talked about grabbing women and assaulting women, and the pushback from those on the right side of political discourse was, well, that's the way men talk. It's locker room
talk. Yeah.
And I was taken at the time by all that, because you need to look at my physical form to know I didn't spend a lot of time in locker rooms. However, however, I have spent a fair bit of time around men, and I think that level of conversation is beyond that. I think it's vulgar and terrible and malicious and assaulting. And I think the point that you're making, AnnaLise, which is so critical here, is that these are conversations we need to have with boys and with men. We need to be talking about accountability. We need to talk about, as you say, like, one pal to the next. Hey, buddy, not good, not cool, right? So elsewhere through all this in the media, I've heard you talk about the gaps and about having to identify where the gaps are. And address those gaps, particularly how they relate to men and accountability. I wonder if you can say more about that, about stepping in and finding those gaps and being intentional as people about addressing that those deficiencies in those open spaces, the gaps.
Yeah. So a little truth talk for a moment. We know that 1 in 3 Canadian women, I know you have an international podcast, so others will have to look up their stats, but in Canada, 1 in 3.
Look it up, folks. Look it up.
1 in 3 will be sexually assaulted over the course of her life. And we know that that's frankly getting out into the public more and more, but we have this sort of thing in our minds that want us to think that it's still the few bad apples doing that. But like, drill that down for a second. 3 women in your life, at least one of them will be sexually assaulted. That's not then 1 in 2,000 men doing that.
No.
Those
Right.
stats don't match up.
Right.
And again, we don't have great research. It's still emerging on perpetration, but from a compilation of peer-reviewed academic journals, what we know is the range for undergraduate men in particular, it's between 14 and 31% will commit a sexual assault. So there's my truth talk for a minute.
Wow.
That makes us incredibly uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Y'all just moved your bodies
Oh.
as an example of that.
I'm so angry.
And it should, and it either elicits anger, defensiveness, whatever it is, but we need to sit in that, because that's the end of the equation that's going to shift this, not the 1 in 3. And that means that you know perpetrators. That means that it is the men in your life, those that you love, that you work with, that are perpetrators. So this concept of treating perpetrators also like the demons is not helpful.
Right.
These are human men who do good things and really bad things. And so how do we hold that two truths? How do we engage them? So when you speak to gaps, Kevin, we haven't done enough to engage men in ways that are not finger pointing, but they're in ways that are also holding to account. So for example, Anova has our man-made program that we run in partnership with Fanshawe and Western in London, our post-secondary institutions. And it's for men who are both mandated and who opt in. So they can be mandated to take it because they've committed sexual violence on campus, or they can opt in because they want to show leadership.
Wow.
So we mix them. And what we do is we sort of co-facilitate it, man and woman. And we talk about the pressures on men in this society around their masculinity and living up to certain standards. We talk about pressures around sexual scripts. Like we have particular sexual scripts in our minds around what the sequence is, who should initiate, where this should go. And that is what really we need to dissect and sort of break down as it relates to, say, drinking culture.
Yes.
If the assumption is that everybody's drunk while they're having sex, that's a sexual script. And that leads to some real vulnerabilities. And then we have a whole focus on accountability. And so what does it mean to apologize? What does that look like? What does it mean to sit in accountability and let the other person drive what rectitude looks like, and sort of that discomfort in there? And by no means are we the only program, nor do we have it all figured out. But frankly, we're one of a few. There aren't a lot. And that's where I think we need more work to address those gaps.
Right. So I think that I really appreciate what you're saying there about the need for us to be able to have these conversations in a way that allows for truth telling. And I think it is uncomfortable. Like you said, we all shift it, right? And to be honest, I think I shifted because I'm now 50, but I wasn't always 50. And I also hold certain values and ideals today that I didn't when I was 18 or 20 years old. And I think a part of the truth telling is coming to grips with the fact, as you say, that is 30% of men include us. I mean, a part of it is a part of the work that I've been engaged in spiritually over these last years is trying to come to grips with the ways in which my own language or behavior or encounters have in any ways assaulted, hurt, or harmed any woman in my life or anyone I've met over the years. And I know that I've got sins to atone for in that. So I think that if we're going to get to a place where we're better, we have to be able to talk about all of that and about toxic masculinity and about, as you say, the scripts that get played out because of that and what is deemed to be, the right or best thing to do as a man. So these sort of programs that you guys are offering, I mean, these are the conversations we need to have, but I think the challenge is the demonization. I think it becomes very easy to sort of finger point and think that somehow or another, as you said, there's 10% of men out there doing all these assaults, where in fact, we're all living out of things that we've learned and we need to unlearn a whole bunch, in my opinion.
Thank you for modeling that sense of accountability. And I think if more men can do that, and if we can hold it, so we like to sort of say, we call upon men in the group to acknowledge a moment where they've caused sexual harm. And we preface that by saying, frankly, it would be really hard to be a cisgendered heterosexual male in this culture and not cause some form of sexual harm, because it is so compelled by how you were called upon to be masculine and the sexual scripts you're called into. And that is not to sort of say you're not to blame,
Right.
but it is to say, in some ways, to normalize it so that we can enter into a sense of accountability through that process.
Right.
And if you haven't directly caused it, you've allowed it to play out beside you.
No. Yeah.
Like
And,
you all know somebody.
without a
Of course.
doubt. Without a doubt.
It's powerful just listening to this because, we're just scratching the surface of you bringing this up and that this is something that you do. But as you're talking, I'm flashing back. I'm flashing back to high school and university and locker rooms and coaches and peers and family members and all that went on. Like, and that was the culture that I was connected to and what was going on back then. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So even in this short talk that we're having today, you could feel the emotion of it and to dig down, as you say, and get deep into that and get honest about that. I could see how that could be incredibly transformative.
Yeah.
So good. So thank you for doing that. That's helpful. Kevin, did you have a?
Sure. I thought it was you
Next.
now, but I can go if
Nope.
you like. Okay.
No, I think that's you, or maybe it's not. Maybe it is me.
No, that is
It can be me.
You.
It
It
can
can
be
be
me.
you.
It can be me this time.
Okay.
We had Kevin mentioned this earlier. We had a guest booked earlier, but she couldn't come, and AnnaLise was gracious enough to jump in at last minute here. Our guest was Nicole Lim, and she's the founding director of an organization called Freely with Hope, and they're a group that works with survivors of sexual assault and rape. And she's coming back in November, so we'll look forward to having her. I wanted to read you something that she wrote about liberation and just get your thoughts on this. She wrote, "It became very clear to me that those who have experienced oppression could be the ones to lead us all into liberation. Through their stories, their wisdom, their experiences of pain, and their models of love, survivors have the potential to become the most powerful liberators in our midst." And that's from Nicole Lim. Her book is Liberation is Here, Women Uncovering Hope in a Broken World. Have you found this to be true in your work at all? And maybe you could talk to us about the ways that these survivors have impacted your own life.
That's so incredibly eloquent. It's sort of hard to follow that. Survivors sort of in their healing journeys, I think, show us all what bravery truly entails. And it's, and for some, it is about sort of, not looking for punishment and sort of repercussion in that particular vein, but looking to sort of acknowledge and have accountability and then loving through that. So many survivors, right or wrong, stay with the person that committed the harm, and the bravery and the love to sort of push through that and still hold accountability is something to be in awe of. Other survivors have pushed for systemic change over the decades that required commitment and decades of perseverance that I can't even remotely fathom in my own life, of constantly telling their story, constantly coming up against large systems. And it is only because of survivors that we have those changes. Like it wasn't others driving that. So, I don't even know where to enter that. Of course, survivors are the sort of the folks that we should look to for bravery. And as she sort of eloquently put, liberation. In my own life, this isn't a job. This is a passion. This is something that's deeply connected to sort of purpose in life for me. And it is through the humanity of seeing survivors that connects. Like, it's not an academic project, right? But it also, and this is sort of perhaps not an alignment, but it is true for me. It is the humanity of the perpetrators that I've worked with that has also been grounding for me and has given me hope. I sort of have said in the last few years that it's been by facilitating those men's groups and how challenging that's been, but also the actual change that holds that has driven me to continue in the field.
It's incredible. I mean, you use the word calling. And I think it's true. I mean, that book, by the way, and Again, I'd recommend it to our audience and to folks. It's called Liberation is Here. Nicole writes about how all of the work that she's been engaged in has led her to unpack things in her own life that she needed to be liberated from, right? So, which is why this whole conversation today is so meaningful for me. I mean, here we are, three sort of white, cisgendered, heterosexual male dudes trying to have a conversation about sexual assault and violence on women. And I think it's critical. This is what we need to be doing. I mean, we've talked about everything else under the sun. This needs to be a conversation that's elevated, and it should be a part of our calling. I mean, we talk about this as AnnaLise has said, she's called to this. It shows in what you do and the passion you have in this work and the ways that you speak about it and the research that you've done. Like every time I hear you or read again something else, somebody just quoted you, I'm like, man, are we lucky in London to have you here? Like the work that you're doing is so critical, and because these are people's lives and it's people's dignity, right? And as you've pointed out, not just the dignity of these survivors, but the dignity of these perpetrators and who they've become when, as a child of God, that's not who they were made to be, right? And so discarding people, whether survivors or perpetrators, really shouldn't be what we're about, but trying to find healing in the middle of all that. I've heard you reflect Twitter-wise and so on about faith, AnnaLise, and we here on the podcast, we talk about that intersectionality between faith and the public square. And I think in a very profound way, the work that you're doing in and of itself is a way you've applied what I believe clearly is some ways in which God has touched your own life. And you express that in who you are and how you're lifting up the dignity of other human beings. So I want to read you one more brief quote from Nicole and pick up your reaction on the other side. In this particular piece, she's writing about learning about the trauma of some women in Kenya and being at total dismay, and her prayer to God really being a lament or a point of exasperation about what's happening to women as they try to go to the bathroom because they have to go outside the village, or so on. So she writes this, directed to God. Where are you? You who are all loving, compassionate, merciful, and gracious. Where are you in the brokenness of this world? Where are you in the lives of little girls who are suffering from violence? Where is your protection over your children, God? Where are you? In silence, she writes, I felt that God was turning those questions on me. Where is your love for my children? Where is your compassion for the innocent? Where is your mercy for the poor? Where is your grace for the exploited? Where is your protection of the oppressed? Where is your justice for the abused? Where are you? As I've asked this question of God so many times, I am softly reminded by God that He is there in the tears, in the pain, in the woundedness of our world. God is here. Can I get your reaction to that?
Oh, I have goosebumps. Yeah, I am in a yearning, seeking space as it comes to my spiritual faith. So I think what resonates for me there is there's days where hold what I'm about to say, but I just want to burn all men down. I am just, I cannot see the goodness through any of that. And she sort of directs that at God, and I at times do, and at times don't know where to direct that.
Right.
And then, there's moments where I reflect back on sort of this work and the journey, and this work is what brought me to my wife. This work is what brought me to coming out, to being able to accept that, because I was able to deconstruct the sexual scripts that I had being given growing up. And if that isn't God's sort of mission through me, I don't know what else is, right? Like that there's moments of goodness, there's moments of shift and change, but it isn't at the scale that I sometimes want. It isn't in the immediacy in the ways that I see. And I don't know, that challenges faith. Of course it does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's something about seeing the way that you interact and the passion you have for the work that says to me that these sorts of questions about where are you, what are you doing about it, if the script has been flipped and it's like, well, where are you? I mean, I think that I'm inspired by the sort of work that you're doing and your peers at Anova and in places all across this country and around the world that are doing similar work. Pardon me. It causes me to ask that question too, because I think Rob can testify to this too. We get engaged in this work. I can't tell you how often in the last nearly 25 years I've been doing this. It's usually women that I've been called to go and try and safely get them out of a house, or, I once had a crucifix thrown at me. Actually, that was my favorite one. I went to help a woman leave and stand by as she left, and the abusive husband threw a crucifix down the hall and told me to go fuck myself. Go fuck yourself, Father. I said, well, I don't like to be called Father. We ordain women, so just call me Kevin. And thanks for the crucifix. But it's we've been in the middle of this, and at times I too have felt that despair of, when does it end? What is all this pain and suffering? But somehow or another, dusting yourself off and having to go and be the love and be the safety and be the place where people can feel okay to come forward is so critically important. And the work that you're doing testifies to that. We see it.
Yep.
Well, thank you.
AnnaLise Trudell has been our guest here on the Vickers Crossing podcast. And AnnaLise, thank you for spending the time with us today. It's been revelatory in many ways. It's been transformative in many ways. And we've just touched the surface on a lot of things. And, we often talk about here in the podcast, we've talked about stuff like, what Black Lives Matter and the pandemic have done to lift those veils, to reveal things about ourselves and our humanity and who we are and where we need to go, and the difficult conversations we need to have. I already got the sense in just our short time together here that veil was lifted in a lot of ways, and so I know people listening will be moved by that. And so thank you for your time and your witness and your calling and for being with us today.
Thank you for holding such a sort of calm, connected space for this conversation, because it's not easy. You did it with lots of grace, and I'm glad it landed well. So thank you.
Well, that was fantastic, guys. I'm so glad we could get AnnaLise to join us on such short notice. And yeah, she said it perfectly. When those last minute things that you don't really think too much about and just come in and have that honest, open and raw conversations, they can be the most powerful. And that certainly was. And so thanks to her for joining us today.
Yeah, amazing. And just to say that for those of us who do live in this area in London, we're very fortunate to have AnnaLise Trudell and the work that she's doing, and all the folks over at Anova who we love and support, and we give thanks for the work that they're doing and encourage them to continue. And we encourage those of you who are listening, if you're looking to support the work that they do, to reach out to Anova and donate and support the work that they're doing over there.
So important. And I know she's picked up a few listeners to that great podcast too. So make sure everybody tunes into that as well.
Piece by
guys,
piece.
That's it. Piece by piece. Yeah, that's it for us today. We want to thank our sponsors once again, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family owned and operated. Thanks to Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved, and to Molly Maid. Remember, make your home a healthy haven, and you do that by calling Molly Maid, and you call today, because they're going to get busy come holiday time. All right.
Praise Jesus.
So
Praise
make sure
Jesus.
Call Tricia and get that done. All right. Once again, I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's. Thanks for being here, everybody.
Kevin George from St. Aidan's Church.
My name is Ian. Thank you for listening.
Kevin, my friend, got to remind you again, but remember to always look both ways.
Always look both ways? Before you cross the street.
I need more cowbell.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!